They said I was never smart enough, but how would you feel if your own mother told CNN? We always believed in her after disowning you at 14 for working at Target. I didn't stop her. I let her speak. Then the producer rolled the clip, her old voice saying, "She's not a Dawson anymore." The audience gasped. The cameras kept rolling, and for once, the truth was louder than her lies. I'm Mia, and this is how I took my name back on live TV. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The smell of coffee and printer paper always hung in our living room. Books stacked on every surface, charts of molecular structures taped to the walls, and the faint hum of my father's computer filled the air. I was 10 that summer in Palo Alto, sitting cross-legged on the carpet with a workbook open on my knees, numbers blurred together. Long division looked like a secret code everyone else had cracked except me. Behind me, my father, Dr. Leonard Dawson, adjusted his glasses and sighed. In this house, he said quietly, "Intelligence is the bare minimum." I nodded without looking up, pretending to keep working. The pencil slipped in my sweaty hand. I wanted so badly to make the answer appear to earn even a tiny nod of approval. From the kitchen, my mother's voice floated out, full of excitement. "Leonard, Clara just got the email from Stanford Kids. They're moving her up to the advanced group. 11 years old and already a prodigy." I heard their laughter, the clinking of mugs. No one asked how my day had been. Later that evening, we sat around the dinner table. Clara sat straight, her brown hair tucked behind her ears, the picture of discipline. I was still in my paint-stained t-shirt from art class. Mom reached into her bag and pulled out a certificate framed in gold trim. "Look at this," she said proudly. "First place in the regional science fair." She and Dad stood to hug Clara, their voices overlapping. "We're so proud, honey." I smiled, because that's what you do when everyone else is smiling. "I drew something at school today," I said softly. "It's going to hang in the hallway next week. Dad didn't even turn his head. That's nice, sweetheart. Now, Clara. Tell us about the AI book you're reading." The words rolled over me like warm water turning cold. My plate of spaghetti tasted like paper. Mom caught me staring at the certificate and muttered under her breath, "I don't know who she takes after to be this slow." That night, I lay awake staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling. The word slow kept echoing until it stopped sounding like an insult and started to feel like a sentence I had to serve for life. A few days later, our neighbor Grace Miller knocked on the back door with a basket of lemons. She was in her 70s, silver hair pinned tight, eyes kind, but sharp. "You look like you've been scolded into silence," she said. When she saw me, I shrugged. "I'm just bad at numbers." "Bad." Grace chuckled, setting the basket down. "No one's bad at numbers, kiddo. You just need to see them differently." She pulled a handful of dry beans from her pocket and spread them on the table. "Let's count. 1, 2, 3. Now divide them into 2 groups. See? You're doing math. It's the same dance, just slower music." Her patience felt like sunlight through a crack in the blinds. For the first time, learning didn't feel like punishment. A week later, we had parent-teacher night. I wasn't supposed to hear anything, but curiosity kept me pressed against the door outside my classroom. My teacher, Mrs. Lopez, spoke gently. "Mia works hard, but she needs extra help. She learns differently." My mother's voice sharpened. "We prefer you don't say things like that. She's fine." "We don't want Clara's classmates thinking her sister is remedial," Dad added. "Just keep her busy with art or something. She'll grow out of it." Through the narrow window, I saw Mrs. Lopez's polite smile fade. My chest tightened. I wanted to run in and tell them I was trying, that I stayed up counting beans and drawing charts, but my feet wouldn't move. On the ride home, the car was quiet, except for the turn signal clicking. My parents talked about how proud they were of Clara's next math competition. I looked out the window at the Palo Alto lights flickering past each one, a tiny world, where maybe another version of me fit in. That night, I opened my workbook again. The numbers still didn't make sense, but I wrote them anyway. Somewhere deep down, I made a silent promise one day. I'd find something I could be proud of, even if no one else saw it. Then maybe the silence at our dinner table wouldn't hurt so much. By the time I turned 12, our house didn't sound like a home anymore. It sounded like a laboratory, where love had been replaced by the steady hum of ambition. The shelves were fuller, the air heavier. My parents had both started working later and speaking louder. The words reputation and publication came up at dinner more often than family. Dad's project at Stanford had just been rejected by a review committee. I remember him slamming the front door that night, his face gray under the porch light. Idiots, he muttered. They wouldn't know quantum symmetry if it punched them in the face. Mom followed him in her heels, clicking like punctuation marks on a bad day. She'd been dealing with her own department crisis, something about data integrity, and a missing ethics form. The rumor mill at Stanford was ruthless. The next morning over cereal, Dad barely looked up from his tablet. "Clara, you need to focus on the National Science Fair. It's time we put the Dawson name back where it belongs." Mom smiled at her coffee cup. "You're our best chance, honey." I stared at the soggy flakes in my bowl. I wanted to tell them about my art show at school, how my painting of the bay had been chosen for the front hallway. But the words stuck. From then on, every meal became a performance review for Clara. She'd talk about coding projects and math contests. My parents would nod approvingly, add notes, plan next steps. If I tried to speak, they'd say, "Let Clara finish, sweetheart." By dessert, no one remembered I'd even opened my mouth. Clara changed too. She stopped inviting me into her room. Her posters of rock bands were replaced with flowcharts and formulas. When I asked if she wanted to go biking to the park, she said she had more important things to do. One night she looked up from her laptop and said half to herself, "Not everyone's built for this kind of work." "What kind?" I asked. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The air in the house grew brittle. I learned to tiptoe around their moods. The clink of a coffee cup on the counter could mean Dad was about to explode about another rejected paper. Mom started carrying her phone even to dinner, checking emails mid-conversation. I noticed her fingers trembling once while reading. Then she smiled too wide and told us everything was fine. One Saturday afternoon, I wandered into the garage where Clara was building a model of a solar reactor for her school competition. The thing looked like a spaceship made of foil and wires. I leaned closer trying to see how it worked and accidentally brushed one of the panels. The foil bent inward. Clara gasped. "Don't touch that." "I didn't mean to," I said, backing up. Mom appeared so fast it was like she'd been summoned. "What did you do?" "Nothing," I stammered. She ruined it," Clara cried. "She always ruins everything." Mom's voice went cold. "Do you have any idea how much time she's spent on this? Why can't you respect your sister's work? You can't stand that she's better, is that it?" I shook my head. Tears burning my throat. "I was just looking." "Go to your room," Mom said, turning away, as if I were a noise she could mute. I lay on my bed for hours, staring at the ceiling fan. Every spin sounded like a verdict. Maybe I really did ruin things. That evening, Grace Miller knocked on our back door with a grocery list in her hand. "Your mom said you might want to help me run errands," she said, smiling. I grabbed my jacket before anyone could stop me. In her old Ford, the radio played soft jazz. Grace let me count the change at each stop. "See these coupons," she said at the checkout line. "It's not just about saving money. It's about paying attention, knowing what you have and what you don't. That's what keeps a person standing." I liked that. Numbers made more sense when they connected to real things. Apple's milk, a stack of quarters that actually bought something. As we unloaded groceries at her house, she said, "You've got a good head, Mia. Maybe not the kind your parents brag about, but the kind that keeps the world spinning." I wanted to believe her, so I did. A few months later, our mailbox overflowed with envelopes stamped MIT. Clara had been invited to their summer research program for high school prodigies. Dad held the letter like a trophy. Mom's eyes shone again for the first time in months. "The Dawsons are back," she whispered. They threw a little celebration. Neighbors, colleagues, too much wine. I helped set up the food, slicing strawberries, arranging plates. When I reached for one of the cupcakes, Mom caught my wrist gently but firmly. "Maybe let Clara hand those out. Okay? We don't want you saying the wrong thing tonight. The wrong thing." "You know how kids talk," she said, smiling tightly. "It's better if you just listen." So I listened. I listened as they toasted to Clara's brilliance, to the family legacy, to redemption. The word legacy hung in the air like perfume, thick, sweet, and suffocating. When the guests left and the lights dimmed, I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by half-empty glasses. Clara was upstairs on a call with her new research mentor. Dad was already drafting a Facebook post about his daughter at MIT. Mom hummed while cleaning up, humming the tune she always did when everything finally looked perfect from the outside. I wiped frosting off the counter and thought about what Grace had said, knowing what you have and what you don't. I didn't have genius or applause, but I had something I couldn't quite name, a small, steady spark that refused to go out. I told myself that was enough, at least for now. The test paper was thin, but it felt heavier than a brick in my backpack. The big red D+ glared up at me like a scarlet letter as I climbed the porch steps. Through the window, I saw the golden light of our dining room, Clara's laughter, my parents' silhouettes. For a second, I thought about throwing the paper away, pretending it never existed. But secrets never stayed buried long in our house. When I handed it to Dad, he read it in silence. The air seemed to tighten. His face didn't change much, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth. A D+, he repeated. Do you even try? Mia? I tried to speak, but Mom's voice cut in like a blade. This is humiliating. The Dawsons are supposed to represent excellence. I studied. I whispered. Dad slammed his hand on the table. Don't lie to me. You've been lazy since day one. We're professors at Stanford, and our own daughter can't pass basic algebra. I'm not lazy, I said, my voice shaking. I'm just not good at math. Not good enough to carry our name, he said coldly. From the hallway, Clara leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. No one made you be the slow one, she said softly, almost amused. The words hit harder than any slap. Dinner that night was silent, except for the scrape of forks. I couldn't eat. My stomach felt like a knot of shame. Dad folded his napkin slowly, precisely, and laid it beside his plate. We've made a decision, he said. After this year, you'll either go to a boarding school that can deal with you, or you'll need to find somewhere else to live. We can't keep doing this. Mom didn't say anything, just nodded. Clara stared at her phone, pretending not to hear. Later that night, I lay awake, listening to their voices through the thin walls. They spoke as if I weren't home. She's holding Clara back, Mom said. If she can't meet basic standards, we can't let her drag the rest of us down. Dad's voice was flat. I'll handle it. She'll either shape up or move out. I pressed my pillow against my face so they wouldn't hear me cry. The next morning, I got up before everyone else and left for school early. The house was too quiet, the air heavy with something final. At lunch, I filled out an application for a part-time job at Target. I told myself it was just to earn spending money. But deep down, I knew it was a way to prove I could stand on my own. By the time I turned 14 that spring, I'd been working there for 2 months. I liked the routine, stocking shelves, counting change, the hum of the scanners. No one cared who my parents were. No one compared me to Clara. Then, one Saturday afternoon, fate decided to humiliate me in fluorescent lighting. I was restocking paper towels when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Excuse me, where can I find the organic detergent? I turned, and there she was, my mother, Dr. Evelyn Dawson, in her tailored blouse and pearls, holding a shopping list. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Mom, I said, my voice small. Her eyes swept over my red Target vest, the name tag pinned crookedly on my chest. Her expression froze into something sharp. What is this? She said quietly. I work here. I said, just part-time. Her face reddened. A Dawson working as a cashier. Do you have any idea how this looks? What will people think if they see you here, Mom? I'm earning my own money. It's honest work. Honest. Her voice rose, echoing down the aisle. It's embarrassing. You're throwing away our reputation for a few dollars an hour. Customers turned to look. My cheeks burned. I wished the ground would swallow me whole. I'm not doing anything wrong, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She stepped closer, her perfume cutting through the air like acid. If you keep working here, you will not use our name. Do you hear me? You are not a Dawson when you stand behind that counter. For a moment, everything went quiet. The hum of the refrigerators, the squeak of shopping carts. All of it blurred. I nodded slowly. Fine, I said. Maybe I never was. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving her basket half full in the cart. I finished my shift on autopilot. When the clock hit 9, I walked the 2 miles home under the streetlights, my red vest stuffed into my bag. The house was dark except for the light in the kitchen. Dad was sitting at the table with a stack of papers. Mom stood beside him, arms folded. You embarrassed your mother, Dad said without looking up. You made a spectacle of yourself. I just wanted to work, I said. You wanted attention, Mom snapped. You've always wanted attention. She slid a document across the table. Sign this. I looked down. It was a form relinquishing parental responsibility, a legal way to protect them if I left. What is this protection, Dad said? For everyone. Something in me broke then. I signed my name with a trembling hand. My mother's signature followed neat and final. Upstairs, I packed my backpack, some clothes, a notebook, Grace Miller's old calculator she'd given me, and the $57 I'd saved from Target. Clara stood in the hallway watching. "You're really leaving?" she asked. I didn't look at her. "You got what you wanted." She flinched but said nothing. When I stepped outside, the air smelled like rain. I walked down the driveway without looking back. The house glowed behind me, warm, perfect, silent. By the time I reached the end of the block, the first drops started to fall. I didn't run. For the first time in my life, no one was telling me what to be. The street stretched out ahead, long and wet, and even though I was soaked through, I felt something new humming under my ribs. Fear, yes, but also freedom. San Jose smelled different from Palo Alto. Less polished, more alive. The streets hummed with taco trucks, bus breaks, and people who looked like they worked for every dollar they made. Lena Brooks picked me up after my last Target shift in Palo Alto, with the windows down and a toddler's car seat in the back. "You're family now," she said as she drove south on 101. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I nodded anyway. Lena's apartment sat above a laundromat, 2 rooms, that always smelled faintly of detergent. Her little boy Joey was 3, a whirl of sticky fingers and laughter. I slept on the pull-out couch and paid half the rent once I started taking more shifts at the Target in San Jose. For the first time in my life, I felt useful instead of measured. I worked mornings unloading trucks, afternoons at the register nights restocking shelves. My feet ached, but the ache felt honest. The managers noticed I could keep track of stock levels without looking at the screen. They started calling me in when shipments were mixed up. "You've got a head for logistics," my supervisor said once. I almost laughed. No one had ever used the word head in a compliment to me before. One afternoon, a customer in a suit slammed a broken blender on my counter. "You people can't get anything right," he barked. "Do you even know how warranties work?" Something in my chest tightened. His voice echoed my father's tone, that crisp contempt of a man, certain of his own superiority. For a second, I saw the old kitchen, the glare of fluorescent lights, the words, "Not good enough." Then I took a breath, met his eyes, and said evenly, "Let's fix this together." I found the correct policy, swapped the item, and handed him a receipt before he could reload his anger. He left, muttering. My hands were steady. That night, I told Lena about it while we sat on her balcony eating instant noodles. She grinned. "That's growth, girl. You didn't let him rent space in your head." Joey was asleep inside his small snores, drifting through the screen door. The sound was soft, safe. I hadn't realized how much safety could matter until I lived in that little apartment. Lena taught me small things: how to stretch a paycheck, how to cook rice without burning it, how to laugh when the washing machine broke again. In return, I helped Joey with puzzles folded. Laundry worked extra shifts when Lena caught the flu. It was messy and loud and nothing like the Dawson house, but it was real. One slow evening at the store, a man with dark hair and a Stanford sweatshirt approached my counter, holding a bag of cleaning supplies. "Someone spilled motor oil in the parking lot," he said, smiling apologetically. "Do you sell anything strong enough to break it down?" I led him to the aisle and recommended an absorbent compound. "You'd be surprised what people dump on asphalt," I joked. He laughed. "You sound like you've studied this stuff." "Not really. Just a lot of cleanup duty." "I'm Noah," he said, extending his hand. "Environmental scientist. We deal with waste, too, only on purpose." I shook his hand, feeling an unfamiliar spark of curiosity. "Mia, cashier/janitor. Then we're in the same business," he said, and left with a grin that lingered longer than it should have. After that day, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, dealing with waste on purpose. Maybe there was something useful in the messes people left behind. A few weeks later, I signed up for a free online course called Introduction to Sustainability. The lessons were hard at first, formulas, energy cycles, but they made sense in a way math at school never had. Everything connected to real things like Grace's beans and coupons like Lena's bills. I studied at night after Joey went to bed, the blue light from the laptop painting the ceiling. One evening I posted a project sketch on a forum, a concept for turning plastic packaging waste into durable material for benches or planters. I didn't expect anyone to notice. The next day my phone buzzed with a message request. "Clara." I hesitated before opening it. Her profile photo showed her in a lab coat, MIT logo glowing behind her. The message was short. Saw your post. Cute idea. You'll never be a researcher, Mia. Leave the science to people who understand it. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I closed the app, deleted the notification, and went back to my lesson on polymer degradation. For once, her voice didn't stick. At Target the next day, I caught myself watching how customers handled packaging, what they threw away, what they reused. I started taking notes in a little red notebook, observations about consumer habits, materials, colors that caught attention. Lena teased me calling it my trash diary, but a pattern was forming in my mind. The logistics of product flow, the waste after use, the supply gaps. Everything I'd learned behind that counter connected like puzzle pieces. What if discarded plastic could come back as something people wanted to keep? One night after Joey fell asleep, I spread my notes across the kitchen table. Lena poured coffee and leaned over. You're thinking big again, she said. What if we could take the stuff nobody wants and make it useful again? Not just recycling, but redesigning. She nodded slowly. Sounds like something the world could use. You gonna do it? I looked at the pages at my rough sketches and circles of numbers that finally made sense. Yeah, I said. Maybe I am. Outside, the city buzzed under the sodium streetlights. Somewhere, a train horn echoed long and low like a promise. For the first time since I'd left Palo Alto, the future didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door. The garage smelled like burnt plastic and bad coffee. We'd been at it for hours trying to get the melted fragments to hold their shape. The air was thick with failure. Noah sat cross-legged on the concrete goggles, slipping down his nose, a streak of soot across his cheek. If we melt one more batch wrong, my landlord's going to think we're cooking meth, he said, laughing weakly. I slumped against the wall, wiping sweat from my neck. It's supposed to be easy in theory, I said. Reheat, press, mold, repeat. But these things just fall apart. He looked at the pile of warped plastic slabs, all of them cracked or brittle. We're close, he said, though neither of us believed it fully. The first months of Terraloop were more stubborn than glamorous. It wasn't even a company yet, just an idea that refused to die. We worked out of Noah's parents' garage in Santa Clara, borrowing their old space heater for the colder nights. When the machine jammed, I'd sit outside with a notebook drawing possible molds, calculating temperature differentials like a student guessing the right answers. Lena lent me $2,000 from her savings to buy new equipment. She said, "Don't pay me back till this thing can stand on its own." I promised I would. Noah's parents. Ellen and Marcus brought food and endless encouragement. Ellen would say, "You two smell like a chemistry set gone rogue," then hand us lemonade. They never once asked about my lack of degree or my past. In their home, I felt something dangerously close to belonging. By 2010, we finally had a prototype, our own polymer blend strong enough to mold into furniture panels. We called it Terraflex. The first sample cracked in half after 2 days in the sun. The second one lasted a week. The third survived a storm. When it didn't crumble, Noah whooped so loud the neighbors complained. We decided to pitch to investors. I borrowed a blazer from Lena, brushed the dust off my shoes, and stood in front of 5 men in an office overlooking downtown San Jose. Their smiles were polite until I introduced myself. "You're the CEO," one of them asked. "Yes." He flipped through the slides. No college degree, retail background. Impressive story, but investors need to trust the captain of the ship. I smiled tightly. The captain built the ship. He leaned back. "You're asking for $1 million. What happens when the science gets complicated?" "It already is," I said, "and we've been figuring it out." The meeting ended with handshakes that meant nothing. In the elevator, I laughed to keep from crying. Noah put his arm around me. "One no closer to a yes," he said. A month later, we finally found a small angel investor who believed in sustainability over pedigree. He cut us a modest check enough to register the company officially. Terraloop was born on a Tuesday afternoon with a bank account balance of $47,000 and a dream big enough to swallow the sun. Things went smoothly for a while. We produced a batch of recycled panels and landed an article in a local green tech blog. Then a letter arrived from the Environmental Protection Agency, temporary halt of production pending permit review. I stared at the notice like it was written in another language. "They can't shut us down," I said. "They're not shutting us down," Noah said carefully. "They just need paperwork. It says we can't sell until they approve our materials. That's months of testing." He touched my hand. "We'll make it through." Those months were brutal. I spent sleepless nights on the floor of the office, drafting reports, and reading EPA regulations until my eyes burned. Lena visited with coffee and Joey's old blanket. "You look like a raccoon with ambition," she said, wrapping it around my shoulders. By the time the EPA finally cleared us, my hair had grown past my shoulders, and my patience had worn thin. But we were still standing. That same week, Clara posted a photo online, her in a white lab coat, MIT banner behind her. Caption: "Another paper accepted. Some people stock shelves, others change the world." The words hit my feed because someone tagged me. For a moment, the old shame rose like smoke. But it didn't stay. I closed the app, opened my laptop, and sent another pitch email. 3 months later, we tested Terraflex in a lab we rented in Fremont. The new blend was stronger, flexible, and water-resistant. I remember watching the pressure gauge rise and waiting for the panel to snap. It didn't. Noah laughed, grabbed my face, and kissed my forehead. "You did it," he said. "We did it." The news spread quickly through local sustainability circles. A city council member from San Jose toured our tiny workshop, running his hand over the panels. "These could work for park benches," he said. "Maybe even playgrounds." I nodded, barely breathing. "We can scale production." Weeks later, the city approved a pilot project for a community park in Willow Glen. Contract value $2.5 million. When the papers were signed, I stepped outside and felt the sunlight on my face. My hands trembled around the pen, the ink still drying on the biggest decision of my life. Noah came up beside me. "You realize," he said, "you just proved every one of them wrong." I looked out at the skyline, cranes rising like promise. "Not yet," I said, "but we're getting there." The wind smelled faintly of melted plastic and asphalt, a scent that used to mean failure but now smelled like victory. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what success might look like when it wasn't defined by anyone else's standards. By 2020, Terraloop was no longer just a garage dream. We had a staff of 30, a small factory in Fremont, and a logistics team that could turn waste into revenue. Trucks arrived every morning loaded with discarded plastic from recycling centers, and every evening we shipped out molded panels for parks, rooftops, and city benches. The hum of machinery had become my favorite sound. I kept a whiteboard in my office where I tracked everything: the tonnage of plastic we'd diverted from landfills, the number of new contracts, the names of cities that had reached out to us. When we crossed 48,000 tons, Noah surprised me with cupcakes that read, "Saving the planet one bench at a time." I laughed until I cried. Public attention followed. Terraloop began appearing in sustainability blogs, then magazines, and finally on regional news. Every time I walked into a conference, people recognized the name. They wanted to hear about the girl who had built a green tech empire, without a degree, the cashier who had changed the industry. In the fall of 2021, I got an email from CNN. The subject line read, "Feature request, America's Green Innovators." I thought it was spam, but when I opened it, there was a signature Rachel Park senior correspondent. She wrote that she'd seen our work at a San Jose expo and wanted to produce a documentary segment about Terraloop's journey. During our first call, her voice was warm, curious. "Your story has a heartbeat," she said. "It's not just business, it's resilience. People will connect to that." I hesitated. "You want to talk about the company, right? Not personal stuff?" "I'd like to tell both," she said. "Where you came from matters. It's what makes this human." For a moment, I thought of my parents, of Clara's perfect life online. The instinct to hide was still there, but it was quieter now. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's do it." Rachel and her crew spent 2 weeks following us. They filmed the plant-interviewed workers, even came to our small apartment in San Jose, where Noah and I still lived modestly, despite the company's growth. The cameras didn't feel invasive. They felt like witnesses. When Rachel asked about my childhood, I told her the truth, not with bitterness, but with clarity. "I learned early that love and approval aren't the same thing," I said. When the segment aired 3 months later, I was in the office surrounded by my team. The headline on the screen read, "From Abandoned Daughter to Green Tech Visionary." My throat tightened. The footage of our machines rolled my voice, narrating how we built Terraloop from scraps and stubbornness. Across the country, in a faculty lounge at Stanford, my parents saw the same broadcast. Later, I'd hear from an old classmate that the room went silent when my face appeared. A colleague asked my father, "Leonard, isn't that your daughter? Amazing work." My father reportedly smiled tightly. "Yes," he said, "we've always been proud. I didn't know any of that at the time. I only knew that my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from old classmates, emails from potential partners, and one short text from an unknown number." Congratulations. I saw you on TV. Clara. I didn't reply. A few days later, Rachel called. The segment's trending, she said. Corporate's talking about a full-length feature. They want you live in New York. The thought made my stomach twist, but I said yes. When opportunity knocks that loud, you open the door. In February 2022, Noah and I flew to New York for pre-production meetings. The studio lights were intimidating, but Rachel's calm presence steadied me. Don't think of it as TV, she said. Think of it as conversation. She asked for more background about my family. When I hesitated, she said gently, "You can tell me what you're comfortable with." Something in her sincerity made me trust her. So I told her everything, about being called a disappointment, about the day my mother saw me at Target, about the papers I had to sign. Rachel took notes quietly. "This isn't gossip," she said. "It's context. And it's important." While Rachel worked on the script, her research team dug into public records. One evening, she called me to confirm a few details. "Did your parents both work at Stanford around 2012? She asked. "Yes. Why?" "There were internal reviews around that time. Ethics investigations. Nothing criminal, but still, interesting timing." My pulse quickened. "You found that I'm not using it unless you want me to," she said. "But it paints a fuller picture of what you were up against." I told her to keep it for now, unsure what that meant. The CNN team scheduled my live interview for April. In the weeks leading up to it, promotional trailers started circulating. I tried not to watch, but curiosity won. The tagline flashed across the screen. From the daughter disowned for not being smart enough, to the billionaire rewriting the rules of sustainability. I froze. The phrase disowned for not being smart enough burned on the screen longer than any other line. It was true, but seeing it there in bold white letters felt like the world peering straight into my old scars. Meanwhile, in Palo Alto, my parents watched the same trailer from the faculty lounge. I can only imagine their faces. Their colleagues clapped them on the shoulders, congratulating them for raising such an extraordinary daughter. My parents smiled, pretending everything was fine. Inside, they must have felt the ground shift. That night, I got a call from a blocked number. I didn't answer. The voicemail was short. "Mia, it's your father. We should talk before this gets out of hand." Noah found me sitting on the balcony phone in my lap, city lights flickering below. "You okay?" he asked. "They saw it," I said. "They know." He sat beside me. "Good. Let them see." For a while we just listened to the hum of traffic, the faraway sound of a siren. Then I said what I hadn't dared to say aloud in years. "They're going to try to take the story back," he nodded. "Then tell it before they can." When the next CNN trailer dropped, a longer cut featuring footage of our plant and a voiceover saying the girl they disowned is changing the world. I didn't flinch. I watched it all the way through. Somewhere I knew my parents were watching too, their perfect facade cracking under studio lights they could no longer control. And for the first time I didn't feel small. I felt seen. The studio lights were so bright they made the skyline of Manhattan outside the window look dull. I sat in the green room with a cup of tea I wasn't drinking, listening to the quiet murmur of production assistants checking their schedules. Rachel walked in, clipboard in hand, her calm presence cutting through the nerves that buzzed under my skin. "You ready?" she asked, sitting across from me. "I think so." I said. My hands were clasped in my lap, fingers interlocked tightly. "I've done harder things than talk," she smiled. "That's the spirit. Just remember, it's your story. Tell it the way you lived it. No one else can do that for you." I nodded. There was no going back now. Outside the dressing room, people rushed through hallways carrying cables, microphones, and coffee. Everything smelled faintly of makeup powder and electricity. I felt grounded in the chaos, almost serene. The version of me from 10 years ago would have been terrified. The version sitting here now had survived far worse than cameras. Across the country, my parents were seeing the final promotional trailer for the segment on a large monitor in Stanford's faculty lounge. "The disowned daughter who became a green tech billionaire," the headline read. The story everyone whispered about in hallways had suddenly become national news. I didn't know it then, but panic had already set in. My father Leonard saw his colleagues exchanging looks, some admiring, others confused. My mother's jaw tightened as she watched the screen, the room spinning around her. Within an hour, they booked flights to New York. My sister Clara joined them reluctantly, more out of image control than concern. When I arrived at CNN Studios the next morning, the sun was just rising over the East River. Rachel handed me the day's schedule, her voice steady but gentle. "They'll mic you up in an hour. We'll film a short segment first, then the live interview. I thanked her and turned off my phone to avoid distractions. That's when one of the studio security guards approached. Ms. Dawson. Yes, there are 3 people downstairs asking for you. They say they're your family. My stomach dropped. What did you tell them that you were busy? Do you want us to escort them out? I paused. Every instinct told me to say yes, but running was what they expected. No, I said quietly. I'll go down. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors opened to the lobby, I saw them instantly. 3 familiar figures standing by the reception desk. My father looked smaller than I remembered, his hair more silver than gray. My mother was still immaculate, clutching her purse like a weapon. Clara stood slightly behind them, glancing around the room, as if afraid someone might recognize her. Mia. My mother said, her voice soft and rehearsed. Sweetheart, it's been so long. Not long enough, I said before I could stop myself. My father stepped forward, forcing a smile. We saw the trailer. Quite something. You're really doing well. I am, I said flatly. Clara tried to smile, but couldn't hold my gaze. The cameras must be exciting, she said. We thought maybe we could see the set. Mom jumped in quickly. Actually, we came to support you. It's wonderful what you're doing for the environment. We're proud. The word proud felt foreign in her mouth. I studied her face for sincerity and found none. Support. I said slowly. You haven't spoken to me in a decade. Dad cleared his throat. We thought maybe you'd exaggerated some things in the trailer. It makes us look, well, like villains. We just want the story to be balanced. There it was. The truth behind their sudden appearance. Mom smiled tightly. Maybe I could join the interview, offer some context. I can explain how things really were. My laugh came out low and sharp. You want to go on air with me after everything? Her expression hardened. We were strict because we wanted the best for you, Mia. You're successful now because of how we raised you. Clara's eyes flicked between us, her cheeks pale. Maybe we should all just calm down. I turned toward her. You watched them tear me apart and said nothing. You don't get to calm it down now. The room went still. A few employees nearby pretended to look busy. I stepped closer to my parents, lowering my voice. You're not here for me. You're here because you're afraid of how it looks. Because, for once, people see me instead of you. My mother opened her mouth, but no words came. My father stared at the floor. Rachel appeared at the end of the hallway, sensing tension. Mia, we're ready when you are. I nodded without taking my eyes off them. I'll be there in a second. Then to my parents I said, You can watch if you want, but you won't be part of it. Not this time. They stood there frozen as I turned and walked away. Every step back toward the elevator felt lighter. In the green room, Rachel adjusted my mic again. You okay? She asked quietly. Yeah, I said, steadying my breath. I finally said what needed to be said. Through the glass door, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. Older, sharper, unrecognizable to the girl who used to flinch at raised voices. Outside the studio window, the skyline shimmered in morning light, and I realized something simple and undeniable. For the first time, my story belonged entirely to me. When I walked out onto the set a few minutes later, I didn't look for them in the crowd. I didn't need to. I could already feel their silence following me, heavy and powerless. The studio felt colder once the cameras powered on. I sat under the bright circle of light while makeup artists dabbed the last bit of powder from my face. Beyond the glass, the audience shuffled quietly into their seats. Rachel adjusted her earpiece, nodded to the floor manager, then turned to me with a reassuring smile. Just breathe, she whispered. I smiled back. My pulse was steady, but my hands trembled beneath the table. 10 years ago, I would have seen this room as a firing squad. Now it felt like a courtroom where truth was finally going to speak for itself. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3. The red light blinked on. Rachel faced the camera. Tonight on CNN Spotlight, we speak with Mia Dawson, founder and CEO of TerraLoop, the green tech company transforming plastic waste into sustainable materials. But Mia's journey wasn't always paved with success. She turned toward me. Mia, thank you for being here. Thank you for having me, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the room. Rachel began with questions about TerraLoop, the numbers, the technology, the impact. I answered smoothly. I'd done 100 interviews before. Then her tone softened. You've spoken publicly about growing up in a highly academic household. Can you tell us what that was like? I knew this was coming. I glanced down at my folded hands. Strict, I said. Competitive. My parents were professors, so everything was measured by grades and IQ scores. My sister Clara was gifted, truly brilliant. I wasn't. Rachel nodded. And that created tension. It created expectations I couldn't meet. I said carefully, when I struggled in school, they saw it as defiance, not difference. I was told, I embarrassed the family, that I wasn't smart enough to carry our name. The audience murmured softly. Rachel leaned closer. You were disowned at 14. My mother found me working at Target. She said if I wanted to keep that job, I couldn't use our name anymore. So I didn't. As the words left my mouth, I saw movement in the corner of my eye, behind the cameras near the crew entrance. My parents stood there with Clara half in shadow. My father's face was pale lips pressed tight. My mother whispered something to him. I could almost read the words on her lips. She's lying, but no one in that studio believed it, Rachel continued gently. You've said before that leaving home was the hardest and best decision of your life. What changed for you after that? I learned self-worth the hard way, I said. Through work, through failure. I started as a cashier, then a stalker, then assistant manager. Every mistake I made became a lesson I actually needed. And somewhere in that process, I stopped believing that intelligence had to be proven with a diploma. Tell me about the moment Terraloop was born. I smiled. It started with a spill in the parking lot. A customer dropped a bottle of motor oil, and I watched how the pavement soaked it up and stained it. I thought, what if we could use plastic waste the same way to build something that lasts, instead of something that pollutes? It sounded crazy, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. As I spoke, clips from our workshop played on the monitors, Noah laughing as we tested a prototype, Lena dropping by with coffee. Ellen and Marcus helping us pack shipments. The images rolled like a movie I'd forgotten I starred in. Rachel asked, what kept you going through the failures? People who saw me before I became someone, I said, Noah, his parents, my friend Lena, they never measured me by what I wasn't. They just believed I could figure things out, Rachel smiled. You once said success was never about proving them wrong. Do you still believe that I hesitated? It used to be about proving them wrong, I admitted. But now it's about proving something to the kid I used to be, the one who thought she wasn't enough. The room was quiet. For a moment, I felt 10 again sitting in that Palo Alto living room clutching my workbook. But this time no one was shaking their head. Rachel tilted her head slightly. Do you think there's room for reconciliation? The word hung heavy in the air. I thought about my parents standing just out of sight, about Clara's message months ago. I met Rachel's gaze. Forgiveness doesn't mean going back, I said. Some relationships end because they need to. I can forgive without reopening the door. A hush spread across the audience. Rachel's eyes softened. That's powerful, she said quietly. She glanced at her notes, then looked up again. We've seen a lot of families like yours. Brilliance and pressure intertwined. Sometimes those environments can turn toxic. We actually found an example that's been circulating online. She nodded to the control booth. The big screen behind us flickered to life. My stomach clenched. It was a clip from years ago. A video of Clara, maybe 19, standing in a dorm hallway laughing with friends. My name came up. She said, my sister. She's the kind who'd fail a personality test. Some people are just born defective. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the lights. Rachel looked stunned herself. She hadn't told me she would show it live. Behind the cameras, Clara's face went white. My mother grabbed her arm. My father's jaw tightened. I took a slow breath and turned back to Rachel. That was the voice I grew up hearing, I said simply. It used to define me. Now it reminds me how far I've come. The silence broke into cautious applause. Rachel looked at me as if to ask whether I wanted to stop. But I shook my head. I wasn't there to hurt anyone. I was there to finish the story. When the cameras finally cut and the red light blinked off, Rachel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You okay? I'm fine, I said, exhaling. That felt necessary. Beyond the glass wall of the studio, I could see my parents still frozen near the doorway, Clara hiding behind them. For a fleeting second, I almost felt sorry for them. Then the moment passed. Rachel's producer gestured that we were done. I stood up, unhooked the mic from my collar. and walked toward the exit. The bright lights behind me dimmed, leaving the stage in shadow. As I stepped into the hallway, the echo of applause faded, replaced by a quiet that felt cleaner than anything I'd ever known. The morning after the interview aired, my inbox exploded. Messages from strangers, former classmates, and even city officials poured in. People wrote about their own families, the teachers who said they'd never make it, the parents who measured love in achievements. I read each message slowly, stunned by how many lives mirrored mine. CNN replayed the segment every few hours. By noon, the video had millions of views online. The comments were overwhelmingly kind. "This is what breaking generational cycles looks like," one woman wrote. "Mia Dawson just told my story." For once, my name felt like something I wanted to keep. While the world watched, my parents scrambled. At Stanford, whispers filled the hallways. Faculty who once sought their approval now avoided eye contact. Students posted clips from the interview with captions like, "Professors of the Year, huh?" My father reacted first. He sent a long, indignant email to Rachel Park insisting that CNN had omitted crucial context. He claimed my childhood had been misrepresented through emotional exaggeration. Rachel forwarded it to me with a single line handled. I knew what that meant. She'd verified everything and wasn't giving him the stage he craved. My mother took a different route. She reached out to an academic newsletter called The Ethical Review and submitted an op-ed titled "The Cost of Misunderstood Parenting." In it, she argued that high expectations were acts of love, and that public narratives like mine distort the sacrifices educators make for their children. Within hours of publication, the comments section turned on her. Readers called it deflection gaslighting, dressed as intellect. Someone even linked court documents from an old Stanford ethics review with her name on it. By evening, the article had been pulled. Meanwhile, Clara faced her own storm. The CNN team had quietly passed their research to MIT's ethics board, which reopened the investigation into her lab data. When the notice came, she reportedly screamed at our parents over the phone. "You told me it would go away," she yelled. "Now I'm the one paying for your mess." The Dawson legacy was collapsing, and I was nowhere near the wreckage. That same week, Noah and I prepared for TerraLoop's biggest press conference yet, a product launch for our new composite line TerraShield. The material was lighter, tougher, and could withstand heat extremes. We'd already signed deals with 2 city councils, and the Seattle board was in talks to fund a new plant. The press room buzzed as cameras flashed. I stood behind the podium, confident in a way that still surprised me. I talked about innovation, sustainability, and second chances, not just for materials, but for people. When the Q&A opened, a reporter raised his hand. "Mia, he said your CNN interview has received massive attention. How do you respond to your family's reaction?" For a heartbeat, the room went still. I glanced at Noah, who gave a subtle nod. "I don't respond," I said. "I told the truth. That's enough." A murmur of approval rippled through the audience. The next question moved on to production timelines, and the tension dissolved. Afterward, as I stood near the stage exit, an older journalist stopped me. "Your story gives people hope," she said. "You didn't just recycle plastic. You recycled your own life." I smiled, both humbled and exhausted. "Maybe we all deserve another use," I said. That night, Noah and I celebrated quietly at home. We ordered Thai food, ate on the couch, and watched the city lights through the window. "You realize what's happening, right?" he said. "Seattle wants you to open a factory. You're about to go national." "Us," I corrected. "We're about to go national." He grinned. "You've built something no one can take from you, Mia. Not even them." I wanted to believe him completely, but part of me still braced for the next blow. The following week, CNN released a follow-up announcement nominations for the Green Innovator of the Year award. My name was on the list. The press release described me as a pioneer in sustainable design and circular economy leadership. I read it twice before it sank in. Noah wrapped his arms around me. "You did it," he said. "You're officially recognized." Across the country, my father sat alone in his office as the news broke. According to a mutual acquaintance, he slammed his laptop shut, muttering that CNN had become a circus. My mother stopped attending faculty meetings altogether. Clara, now suspended from her research position, moved out of their house. The irony wasn't lost on me. The people who once measured my worth by their standards were now being measured by mine. But success didn't taste like revenge. It tasted like relief, quiet, steady, and real. That night, I lay awake thinking about the journey from a red Target vest to a billion-dollar company. Somewhere along the way, the fear had burned out, replaced by something softer. Not triumph, not even forgiveness, just peace. The next morning, an email from CNN's awards division arrived in my inbox. Congratulations, Mia Dawson. You've been selected as a finalist for the Green Innovator of the Year. I closed my eyes, let the words sink in, and whispered into the stillness of my apartment for the kid who never fit in. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos, but I felt untouchable, like I had finally found the rhythm that had eluded me all my life. The chandeliers at City Hall glittered like a sky full of diamonds. Music from a live string quartet drifted through the air, elegant and weightless. I stood near the marble staircase, my name pinned to a lanyard that read, Keynote Honoree, Mia Dawson. The crowd was a blur of suits, sequins, and small talk. Noah's hand rested lightly on my back. Breathe, he whispered. You've got this. I did. For the first time in my life, I felt completely steady in my own skin. Rachel Park waved at me from across the room, phone in hand, giving me a discreet thumbs up. She looked proud, and, in a strange way, I wanted to make her proud too. A host announced the lineup of honorees. Each name met with applause. When mine was mentioned, the camera flashes brightened. Tonight, the announcer said we celebrate visionaries who have changed the way our cities breathe. Literally. Please welcome Terra Loop founder Mia Dawson. As I made my way toward the front, Noah walked beside me until the security line then stopped. Go knock them dead, he murmured. I smiled and stepped up to the stage stairs. The applause was polite but warm. I caught sight of the mayor, a few corporate heads, and surprisingly Rachel in the press row, nodding encouragement. The master of ceremonies handed me a small plaque engraved with my name. I was about to speak when movement in the front row caught my eye. My breath caught. There they were. My parents, my mother immaculate in a navy blazer clutching a purse like it held her dignity, my father beside her, jaw tight, pretending calm. Clara was with them, fidgeting in her seat. They weren't supposed to be here. No invitation, no warning. I felt a flicker of old panic, the kind that tightens your lungs before your brain can catch up, but I forced myself to exhale to stay anchored. I stepped up to the microphone. Thank you, I began, voice steady. When we started Terra Loop, the goal wasn't fame or fortune. It was survival. Our planet's, and in many ways, my own. Then from the audience, my mother stood. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the lights, but she was walking toward the stage, her heels sharp against the marble. Security glanced at each other uncertainly. Before I could react, she climbed the steps and reached for the microphone. Excuse me, she said to the MC with a smile too sweet to be genuine. I'm Dr. Evelyn Dawson, Mia's mother. I'd like to say a few words. Gasps rippled through the room. The MC hesitated, looking to me. I nodded once. Let her talk. My mother turned toward the crowd, radiating false composure. We've always known our daughter was extraordinary, she said, her voice smooth, rehearsed. Even as a child, she was creative and determined. We couldn't be prouder of what she's achieved. I watched her hands tremble slightly as she clutched the microphone. Sometimes, she continued, parents make mistakes, pushing too hard, expecting too much. But it all comes from love. We're simply grateful she's found her way. A polite murmur spread through the audience. For a few seconds, the air itself seemed to tighten around me. She was rewriting history live in front of the people who had witnessed my story. When she turned to hand me the microphone, I didn't take it immediately. I looked at her face, the perfectly painted calm, the thin smile, the eyes pleading for control. And then I took the mic. Thank you, Mother, I said evenly. You've always had a gift for saying the right words at the right time. Her smile froze. I turned to the audience. What she didn't mention is that there was a time she refused to call me her daughter. That she told me to change my last name because I didn't fit the family's standards. I don't bring this up out of bitterness. I bring it up because stories like mine don't begin with applause. They begin with silence. The room fell still. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant rustle of a camera shifting focus. Rachel, sitting near the back, gave a small signal to the tech booth. On the large screen behind us, a clip from my CNN interview appeared. The moment where my mother's old words echoed, caught on record. If she insists on that job, she's not a Dawson anymore. The footage froze on her face. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father stared at the screen, his color draining. A collective gasp rolled through the audience. I faced them again. That's what was said to me on the day I was told to stop being a Dawson. So tonight, let's be clear. I'm not reclaiming that name. I'm not ashamed of who I became without it. My voice steadied, gaining strength with every word. Success doesn't erase the past. It reveals who stood by you when no one else did. And for me, that wasn't family by blood. It was the people who believed in second chances. My mother stepped toward me, whispering urgently, "Mia, stop this. You're humiliating us." I shook my head. "No, Mother. You did that yourself." The silence was deafening. No one moved. Even the MC looked pale. Rachel's camera crew caught everything. The crowd's disbelief, my mother's stunned expression, my father's clenched fists. Finally, I turned back to the microphone, lowering my voice. To everyone here, honor isn't inherited. It's earned. And dignity doesn't come from a name. It comes from truth. Then I handed the microphone back to the MC, nodded to the audience, and stepped away from my mother. Applause started slowly, tentative, uncertain, but it grew building like a wave. I saw faces vase light with understanding, empathy, awe. Rachel stood, clapping eyes glistening. My parents remained frozen on stage. No one clapped for them. I walked down the stairs into the aisle where Noah was waiting, his hand outstretched. I took it. The roar of applause followed us out of the hall, echoing through the marble corridors like a thunderstorm. Outside, the night air hit me cool and sharp. I looked up at the skyscrapers, their lights glowing steady in gold. Somewhere behind me, cameras flashed, voices called my name, but I just kept walking. For once, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was clean, like breathing fresh air after years of holding your breath. The morning after the ceremony, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. My inbox was flooded again, but this time it wasn't just fans or journalists. It was everyone. Editors, professors, old acquaintances, people I barely remembered from school, each message carrying the same stunned admiration. The New York Times headline read, "Mia Dawson redefines power and family at City Hall." The Washington Post called it a reckoning wrapped in grace. When I scrolled through social media, my name was trending. Mia Dawson wasn't just a person anymore. It was a movement. People shared clips of my speech with captions like, "She said what so many of us wish we could say." I sat at the kitchen table, barefoot, hair still tangled, drinking coffee as the world digested my truth. Noah came in, tie half-done, eyes full of quiet pride. "You broke the internet," he said. "I didn't mean to." I said, maybe not, but maybe the internet needed it. By noon, major networks had picked up the story. Rachel Park's feature became one of CNN's most viewed segments of the year. She sent me a short message. "You changed something, Mia. Not just for you." While my world seemed to open wider, my parents' world collapsed inward. Stanford launched an internal ethics review of both of them, citing new evidence and renewed public concern. The investigation reopened questions about the 2012-2018 research irregularities they thought were buried. Colleagues who used to greet them warmly now turned away in hallways. Invitations to panels and conferences disappeared overnight. A former student tweeted, "Funny how the professors who preached integrity turned out to have none." Mom resigned from the university's ethics board within a week. Dad's lectures were quietly reassigned to another faculty member. Their names still hung on office doors, but the respect had been scraped clean. Clara didn't escape untouched either. MIT's board placed her on temporary suspension pending a full investigation into her data. When the news broke, she called me for the first time in 10 years. I didn't pick up. Later, I got a text, "I'm sorry for everything. You didn't deserve any of it." They made me feel like I had to be perfect. I wasn't. I stared at the screen for a long time. I typed, "I know," and deleted it. Healing wasn't something that happened in a single message. It would take time, if it ever came at all. Meanwhile, life moved fast at Terraloop. Our valuation climbed to $1.3 billion after a new investment round. Seattle's City Council approved construction for our second facility, and requests poured in from across the country. It was the kind of success I used to think only happened to other people. One afternoon, Noah burst into my office, his laptop in hand. "Guess who just called?" "Please don't say my mother." He laughed. "Better. The organizers of Tech for Tomorrow. They want us to keynote in Los Angeles next month. Both of us, yeah. You'll open. I'll follow with the tech segment." The idea made me nervous and proud all at once. I'd been on stages before, but this felt different. This wasn't about survival. It was about vision. When we flew to LA, the conference hall was packed. I stood backstage watching the crowd ripple with energy. Posters of innovation, sustainability, and circular economy filled the walls. I looked at Noah, who gave me that quiet, grounding smile. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded. Always. The speech went flawlessly. I talked about failure as a resource, about how broken systems, and people, can still be repurposed into something stronger. The applause felt less like praise and more like collective understanding. Afterward, reporters swarmed. One asked if my family had tried to reach out since the City Hall incident. I answered simply, "They have, but the truth doesn't need permission to exist." That quote ended up in half the articles the next day. When we returned home, the days blurred together in meetings, design sessions, and investor calls. Yet, amid the noise, I found myself craving quiet. One evening, I went for a walk alone through the old industrial district where our first factory stood. The air smelled like metal and rain. I passed the worn sign that still read Terraloop, established 2017. For a moment, I saw my younger self there, hands raw from work, eyes full of fear. And I wanted to tell her it was all going to make sense one day. A week later, Rachel's byline appeared again on CNN's website. The article was titled, "The Cost of Silence." I clicked on it and read slowly. Sometimes success isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about daring to stand where truth has no allies and saying, "I am still here." Mia Dawson did that, and the world listened. I read the final line twice, then set my laptop aside. Noah came in, drying his hands from the kitchen sink. "What's that look?" he asked. "Just gratitude," I said. He walked over, kissed the top of my head. "You earned it." I leaned back against him, letting the weight of the last decade fall away like dust from a long-forgotten coat. Outside, the lights of San Jose blinked against the night, a city built on innovation and second chances. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from my past. I was walking steadily toward a future I'd built myself, brick by brick, truth by truth. By late 2024, California had learned to speak the language of green. Billboards along Highway 101 flashed with slogans about sustainability, and Terraloop's logo sat proudly on more of them than I could count. The day of the grand opening arrived bright and clear. The largest park in the state, built entirely from our recycled composite material. Reporters clustered near the gates. City officials adjusted their name tags, and a brass band tuned up under a white canopy. Noah and I stood behind the stage watching workers unroll the final banner. It read, "Willow Creek Eco Park, a partnership between Terraloop and the city of Palo Alto." I hadn't said that city's name aloud in years. It felt strange on my tongue, almost like forgiving it. As we waited for the ceremony to start, I wandered away from the crowd. A few blocks north, the neighborhood hadn't changed much. The same tree-lined streets, the same cracked sidewalks, the same scent of jasmine after the morning sprinklers. My old house stood exactly where I'd left it, painted the same shade of white, though the garden was wilder now. The curtains were closed, and the mailbox leaned slightly to one side. I stopped at the gate not to go in, but just to look. I expected some ache to rise in my chest, some buried grief to resurface. But there was only stillness. The house no longer felt like a wound. It was just architecture bricks and glass containing other people's regrets. As I turned to leave, a familiar voice called from across the street. "Well, I'll be damned. If it isn't the girl who used to water my azaleas wrong." Grace Miller stood in her driveway, leaning on a cane, her silver hair pinned back with the same plastic clip she'd worn years ago. I laughed, really laughed, and hurried over. "Mrs. Miller." She opened her arms, and I hugged her carefully but tight. Her frame had shrunk, but her spirit hadn't. "Look at you," she said, patting my cheek. "Saving the world while I can barely save my begonias. You saved me first." I said, my throat tightening. "You taught me more about life than anyone else ever did." Her eyes softened. "Honey, all I did was show you how to count with beans and coupons." "That was enough," I said. She chuckled and squeezed my hand. "I saw your speech on TV, you know. You had them all standing up by the end. Your mama must have hated that." I smiled sadly. "They'll be here today, somewhere in the crowd." Grace tilted her head. "And how do you feel about that?" "Ready," I said. By the time I returned to the park, the mayor had started his welcome speech. Rows of chairs filled the lawn. Scientists, city leaders, families, even a few school kids holding tiny green flags. I took my seat in the front row beside Noah. Rachel sat a few rows back, notebook in hand, her knowing smile steady as ever. When they called my name, the applause came like a wave. I stepped onto the stage, the sunlight warm on my shoulders. The podium felt familiar, but the fear that used to live behind it was gone. "Good morning," I began. A decade ago, I couldn't have imagined standing here. Back then, I thought success meant becoming who others expected me to be. Today, I know success is building something bigger than yourself, and leaving it cleaner than you found it. I gestured toward the park, where children were already climbing on recycled benches and slides. This place used to be a landfill. Now it's a playground. Proof that transformation is possible even from what's been thrown away. People, too, can be rebuilt. You don't need permission to start over. You just need the courage to believe you can. Applause rolled across the crowd. I caught sight of Noah in the front row, pride shining in his eyes. Behind him, near the back fence, 3 figures stood apart from everyone else. My parents and Clara. They looked older, smaller, worn by their own undoing. Clara's face was blank, unreadable. My father's shoulders sagged, my mother's lips pressed thin. None of them tried to come closer. For once, I didn't need them to. Their silence was the only apology they had left. When the ribbon was cut and the cameras flashed, Noah came up behind me and slid his fingers through mine. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it." He smiled. "This is only the beginning." I looked around. The recycled walkways gleaming in the sun, the sound of laughter carrying through the air, the city officials shaking hands and taking photos. For the first time, I felt no pull backward, no ghost of expectation, just the steady hum of the life I'd built from the scraps of my own past. Later, as the crowd thinned and the evening light softened, Rachel caught up with me by the fountain. "You going to say something to them?" she asked, glancing toward my family still hovering by the gate. I shook my head. "No. Some stories end quietly." Rachel nodded understanding. "Then I'll see you at the next headline, Ms. Free Woman." When she walked away, I stood for a while watching the sun dip behind the trees. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying the faint smell of plastic and earth. An odd but honest scent of rebirth. Noah joined me again, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "Feels different, doesn't it?" "It feels right," I said. He kissed my temple. "Let's go home." We walked down the path lined with recycled stone, past the stage, past the laughter, past the ghosts. I turned one last time toward the crowd, toward the camera that still lingered nearby, and spoke, not to them, but to anyone who might be listening. "My story isn't a fairy tale," I said. "It's a reminder. If you've ever been told you're not enough, prove to yourself that you are. You don't need their permission to begin again. Just your own." And with that, I took Noah's hand, and together we walked into the fading light, free at last.